And first item on the agenda is CH2M Master Plan Alternative Discussion, and we, how long do they have?
It'd probably take about an hour is what our
Okay.
guess is.
Yeah, you're on the clock, and I don't know what you're gonna say, but just keep putting up that picture where those rocks where they are, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. Don't change that picture. All right, you guys are on.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk to you about the master plan project that's been underway for several months now. Of course, you notice that I'm a new face amongst the crowd. I started with CH2M Hill about 7 weeks ago, the first part of August. I will be, the role that I will have in your master plan project is helping our team, CH2M, RSNH, John and staff, and of course you as board members, finishing out the project. Just a little bit of my background. I've been working in the airport industry in the Northwest for about 21 years. I started my career in airport operations, airport management. I moved to agency work with the Colorado Division of Aeronautics for several years. Met my wife in Denver, and she was from Idaho, and we moved up to Boise, Idaho about 8.5 years ago when I became a consultant. So that's been my track. I am a licensed pilot, though I found other hobbies because I didn't find a job where I was getting paid to fly. I found other hobbies, and I'm not current right now, but I do have my pilot's license and do love aviation and love to fly. So thank you for, again, the opportunity to be here. Quickly go through a couple let me point out another introduction. Bill Van Herky, you all know him. He had to leave to catch a flight back to Denver here in about 15 minutes, so he apologizes for having to leave. But a key team member is here today, Kevin Stocker from RSNH. He'll help me out with some of the presentation material regarding the terminal expansion areas, ideas. RSNH, of course, has been an important player with your recent terminal renovations. They've been a key player in helping us as we've been working through the analysis of the master plan. My co-worker, Laura Holtis, has been here before. She's talked to you about the master plan purpose. I won't go through this in a lot of detail. Suffice it to say, as you know, this is a 20-year planning horizon that we're looking at. Chairman Talcott called us the 20-year planning guys when we saw them earlier, and I've not been called that before, but that's exactly what it is. A 20-year plan, really looking at the potential growth of the airport, both from employment, passenger standpoint, to landside access parking, terminal facilities, general aviation facilities, and whatnot. The process and schedule, and it has been a process, as you are no doubt aware, is a process that typically takes about 16 to 18 months. So far, so good in terms of schedule. I'll talk about that in a second. But a couple of the key areas, phases that we've been through to date include the inventory portion where we collect the data on what you have out there that helps us determine where you need to go. A critical step along the way was the development of the aviation activity forecast that identified the number of employments, passengers, number of operations, number of based aircraft that you can expect here at the airport based on data available to us today that we have to plan around in the future. And that is one of the two elements of the master planning process that is approved by the FAA, and that approval for the aviation activity forecast came back in February. So since then, we've been working on facility requirements. Once we know that the amount and types of activity that your airport is expected to accommodate in the 20-year time frame, we have to understand what your current facilities can address and where you may be deficient. And so over the course of this last summer, we've been putting that together. Members from the CH team, members from RSNH have been talking to staff, talking to tenants about some of your facilities. And that leads us to where we are today in terms of the alternatives evaluation process. To me, this is one of the most critical steps along the way because this is where you start to really see the future of your facility and your airport take shape. And I'll get into some of the details as we get through some of the slides. I just mentioned the schedule. Again, 16 to 18 months. We're in really good shape right now. And that puts us towards a completion date of springtime of 2016. So far so good with the schedule. Part of the alternatives process and making our way into developing the ultimate layout of your airport is stakeholder coordination, a lot of interaction with you as board members, as airport users, as airport tenants. And in that regard, the last couple days, we've held a couple more meetings. Last night we had a public meeting, open house. Unfortunately, we didn't get a great turnout. We had a couple folks attend, and we talked about some of the same items I'm discussing today. We looked at the boards around the room, got some good feedback. A carryover for this morning at 9:30 this morning, we had a stakeholder meeting with several of the tenants in particular. Again, had a really nice dialogue, exchange of information, some ideas that are really important for us as we work through the process to finalize the plan. I just mentioned interaction, and you as board members, it's very important as we move through my presentation. And Mr. Chairman and John, I'll leave it up to your discretion, your pleasure, how you want to handle it. I did hear a comment about all the nice boards we have laid out around the room. They show various alternatives, initial conceptual alternatives on some of the ideas that we've come up with to date. I don't know if you want to break and have everybody go take a look at those. I'll go through some of the finer points, if you will, on the PowerPoint here, and then we can decide what we want to do at that point to really get some dialogue going. But I'd like to hear your comments and ideas and thoughts. And I know there's going to be a lot of information coming your way, but please share any ideas and questions you have along the way. A little interactive session we'll have towards the end. I won't get into all of the details now, but as we put together our alternatives and we start to refine to what we call the preferred alternative, we don't do this just willy-nilly. We establish a set of evaluation criteria that we basically review and score some of the alternatives so that there's good justification and good basis in place, a breadcrumb trail, if you will, that gets us down for not only you all as decision makers, but FAA, tenants to understand how we've evaluated each of the alternatives that we've developed and ultimately deemed the preferable one, and balance that out with all of these different needs. A couple examples. Are these alternatives compatible environmentally? What are the cost considerations? How do we phase those? Do they fit in with operational requirements, FAA design criteria? And I'd like to hear some of your feedback on those as we get towards the end of the presentation here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on airside alternatives. You're all aware of the 2012 airfield optimization study that was completed, and out of that study, most of the decisions were made, really directions set on what the ultimate configuration of your airfield will look at. There's a couple exceptions that I'm going to talk about here. Let's see, a couple of other ideas that we need to take into account here that were outside of the optimization study. De-icing facilities. FedEx has indicated their need and desire for a de-icing capability over on their parcel, their leasehold. We also want to look at something more centralized for the airlines and GA traffic that will need de-icing capabilities. So
well, in the military, with the change over to the C-130s, they're de-icing on the ramp right now, which flows into a grass ditch, and that's not the best management practice. Over time, that can be a real remediation issue. The state did approve it temporarily, but in our session this morning, which they attended, we kind of told them, we're going to have to migrate you on to something that goes into our glycol ponds. The majority of the glycol pond effluent is evaporated off, which is best management practices. If you just put a black lined pond out there, most of it will evaporate. And so over the next few years, Rod and I have been talking about this quite a bit. We need to establish a centralized location where they can be de-iced at the same location as the airlines and have that effluent collected and gotten rid of properly rather than allowing it to flow into a grass ditch.
Doesn't the airline just do it right out?
They do. We have a slip ramp at the back of the terminal ramp, and so it all flows that way, and that leads right into the solution. We have a lot of airspace, a lot of ramp space, which you'll see in some of the terminal development options towards taxiway A. So what we can do is go out between Romeo 2 and Romeo 1 and 2, isn't it?
Yep.
Which are the two inlets into the terminal. build a new ramp, which is basically a taxi lane bypass, and then that way we can have a flow, what we would call a flow through or a conga line type of de-icing place where on your way to the runway end, you simply drive through off taxiway Romeo 1 into 2 or from 2 into 1, depending on which way the airfield's flowing. De-ice right there on that centralized pad, and we just tilt it back towards the terminal, and it goes right into the current slip ramp out to the glycol ponds. So it's a fairly, nothing's inexpensive when you're talking about concrete pads, but it's a fairly inexpensive way to modernize, our de-icing capability with the existing infrastructure and include the guard in that. And Dwight would probably tell you that extra space would be super handy on a lot of days when we've got heavy snow, because of course everybody's leaving at the same time right now, all 3 airlines trying to get out at the same time. They could line up and not block the entire terminal ramp and get in and out without giving him a spot to operate safely, so he's not competing with moving airplanes with his trucks. So we like that solution probably for the nearer term. Like I said, over the next few years, we really need to consider trying to get the C-130s out of that current de-icing situation.
But FedEx wouldn't come across.
FedEx, that's one of the reasons I went to Memphis as we were in this planning process. We wanted to talk to them about a couple different things, and one of the things I asked them is, can you de-ice in the centralized facility? They really have some reservations with that. They want to do it at the ramp where they have more control and they can, they can have it right there. So we've come up with, I came back from that, talked to the master plan consultants, and you'll see some drawings there. We've got an idea. One of the problems today is it all flows into an underground vault with FedEx. It's an older, a last generation system or a past generation system. And so instead of trying to evaporate it off or collect it and recycle it, which is what most airports do today, it all flows into a sanitary sewer. And so there's no opportunity to pre-treat it. So you're getting a lot of volume of water along with that, because it's going to melt water, right? And so it's a high BOD or biooxygen degenerate contributor. It messes up the chemistry in the sanitary sewer. So the city has told us, over time we need to find some other way to do this. So we think we've got a way to put in a glycol pond at FedEx, fairly inexpensively, that would take care of this issue and modernize their collection at their location. So we've got some options. We want to get that into the master plan again, so it was evaluated with everything else.
Another need identified is some remaining overnight parking in the terminal apron area. I'll show that a bit. Kevin,
that's for airplanes, so we can park planes overnight off gate.
Kevin will talk a little bit about that when the terminal discussion comes about. We're also going to be looking at the potential for improved instrument flight procedures, primarily on the runway 34 end. You've got excellent procedures in place for most of the other airfield configuration, but there is a potential with new GPS, WASP technology, using the satellite systems that we may be able to improve what's existing on the 3.4, future 3.5, and even more. And there's some potential impacts to that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. The project's underway, the design's underway for crosswind runway 1634. Considering that runway 725 as part of the optimization study will be closed. That's one of the findings. Focusing now on 1634 and taxiway Charlie, the parallel associated with that.
And the only new development on that is, as we've worked through what I call the paperwork extension, that runway, when it was taken off of 321, they used to intersect. When it was disconnected from runway 321, it wasn't done very artfully because it was planned to be closed a few years later, and so there wasn't much thought put into that runway configuration. Now that that's our primary runway, the optimization study, we kind of discussed it with the FAA. They want us to keep 725 at 3,500 feet long by 75 feet wide. The majority of our daily fleet can't use that runway at those dimensions. We asked to switch. Runway 16 is now our crosswind runway of the future. We now think we can get that to 6,030 feet, which is a critical development that would allow us to get most of the commercial fleet of the future to use that runway if we have a major closure on 321, multi-day accident. or a big construction project. It allows us to shift the airflow over to the 1634. The majority of the airplanes using the airport can use that runway at 6,000 feet. And allows, like Billings had those runway closures every weekend all summer 2 years ago. We're trying to avoid that by increasing the capability of 1634. So at 6,000 feet, that's the new development. We're really excited about that. That gets us most of the fleet, most of the commercial airlines, and everybody could probably use that runway.
John, was that done by shortening the overruns, or?
Yes. You can displace the threshold, and you can claim the other end of the pavement on takeoff. And so it wasn't done, like I said, very artfully, very thoughtfully. They just basically looked from stop bar to stop bar and said, that's the length. What we can do is we can refile that and reclaim that additional pavement at the end for takeoff, because obviously the plane doesn't care whether or not it's striped for use. If it's hard pavement, it's available for stopping the plane once it's spooled up to max speed. So you can actually claim that as a takeoff distance, which is the critical element for these regional jets. They are big runway users. Doesn't seem right, but a 737 uses far less runway than a CRJ 200. So I mean that's what we're fighting for, is those extra feet mean that we can stay operational during a runway 321 closure.
Another airside element that we will include is the salt landing zone that the Guard has requested and would like to use. We'll show this as a parallel to 1634. It will be spaced via FAA design standards at 700 feet to allow simultaneous VFR, visual flight rules. When the weather's good, they can use that together if need be. It'll also be available not just to the Guard, but will be available to the general public as well, which I think that excites the general aviation community, that some of the asphalt can be tough on tires and whatnot, especially some of the backcountry type flying. So this will be a useful facility as well.
And I'll just point out on that, as we do this master plan, it's really important for us to show facilities that might happen in the future, because at the end of this process, a cumulative environmental analysis is done. And that clears the way for future environmental processes on projects that are in the master plan. Once they're published, they're out in the public, and it's considered a comprehensive evaluation, environmental evaluation that's done at the end of the master plan. As we move these projects into implementation, it allows us to do many of them under what's called a categorical exclusion, which is simply a checklist that takes a couple of months to process, as opposed to doing a full NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act evaluation, or something in between, which can take several years. So if projects like this, the salt strip, if we think conceptually they're possible, we want to get them in there so that environmental review is included in there and the public notices are all taken care of. We can look back at the plan and say, yes, that was envisioned, yes, it was analyzed, and move it and make the argument towards doing a categorical exclusion as opposed to a bigger environmental process.
And that's a good segue into the future parallel runway. This has been shown on at least one past ALP. I'm not sure if it was on
the current ALP.
The airport layout plan. Again, this is post-planning period. We didn't see anything in any of the analysis or information that we analyzed that dictates need for this facility right now. But as John was mentioning, from an airspace protection, from a land use protection standpoint, continuing to show this on the airport layout plan is very important, and we plan to carry that forward. Real quick, when we look at, again, Kevin will get into this in a minute, when we talk about how we look at expanding the terminal and some potential ideas, that's going to have impacts on the terminal area, the space we have available for aircraft movements, the need for the pavement area, apron pavement. Talked about the de-icing facility or potential between Romeo's 1 and 2. We also talked today about maybe doing something in here if need be. But then these remain overnight stands, we show 4 spots right now. We know that there's potential and room for accommodating those needs and uses down the road. Here's an overall layout of what the airfield configuration facility will look like. A couple of things I want to point out here, a little bit different from this drawing, is this location of this long taxiway structure out to the new potential parallel. This right here we're going to show as an area reserved for future terminal planning, terminal development. The reason why we're going to look at that is, again, save space keep that fresh in people's mind and plant the seeds. But at some point, even considering the improvements that Kevin believes that we can come up with for the terminal area and its existing location, at some point, you're going to reach maximum capacity, and you're not going to be able to do anything in that area that's going to be cheap. So at that point, it might make sense to look at the other side of the airport and look at starting from a greenfield site and starting from scratch, allow a lot more flexibility, a lot more ideas and ways to utilize that space to really accommodate future demand. So that's something that, talking to John and Rod, we want to really show on this next iteration.
Yeah, it's important to leave breadcrumbs for the future authority board, for the future authority administration, to show them what areas we're holding back for those types of developments. So, I mean, the tipping point, we've been talking about the last couple of days, if we run out of parking and we have to, and you've got the alternative of maybe we go to structured parking, that's $15,000 a stall. And so, I mean, we have 1,000 stalls today, you're gonna have to build, say, 2,000 for the future, that's $30 million. And in today's dollars, you could go out for, say, $55 million, and $60 million tops, and you could build a brand new terminal with surface parking lots that would serve it for many, many years. That's a better investment for our future. Any of the issues you deal with here in terms of long-term sustainability of a 1970s building are gone. You're in a new facility. You've got new infrastructure backbones. You're in a greenfield site, which is going to be much cheaper to develop than developing over top of an existing site. There's just a lot of sense in that kind of thinking. So that parcel there we see as important to the long term, even beyond the 20-year period, development of the airport as a potential site to relocate the commercial passenger operations.
Another area to point out is with the construction of Taxiway Charlie associated with 1634, as well as the parallel on the north side of 321, that really opens this area up in here also for future potential large aviation development, maintenance, manufacturing facilities, those types of things. So we'll show that. I mentioned the impacts of maybe improving instrument approach capabilities to this runway, and with that may come an increase in the size of the runway protection zone, and we'll see this in a few minutes. That may intrude actually on some of the available space for general aviation development. So those are some of the things that we'll have to balance out, and you all will have to prioritize as we work through the process. The next set of slides, I know this has been a topic of conversation for quite some time, is what to do with future fuel farm options and fuel farm facilities. We know today that the existing facility is working and things are okay, but at some point, probably sooner rather than later, those facilities are going to need to be addressed and replaced. So what we've come up with as part of this process is looking at some preliminary relocation sites, understanding that things can change, but what we would like to accomplish as part of this master plan, and talking with the stakeholder group earlier especially, is understand the full need of the facilities, not only just the fuel tanks themselves and the pads associated with the fueling facility, but what about your ancillary equipment that goes along with the fueling facility, like the trucks. We need to understand the size and scope of those facilities and where they will best fit in various locations on the airport. We've started that process as part of this alternatives analysis. We've identified, I think, several good sites that offer some potential benefits and options, and now it's a matter of working with you to refine which would ultimately be the preferred, or maybe even two sites if we split facilities. The first couple areas that we've looked at are up around FedEx. In working through the issue of de-icing for FedEx, they have indicated they would like to de-ice on their existing apron. And this area over here actually seems to be the most logical place for a glycol pond. So that may rule out this one, but we wanted to show that in fact could work if you wanted to go that direction. The other would be on the west side, if you will, of FedEx on the back side. It seems to work. The envelope would seem to work okay. Alternative 2 is near the existing location. We would actually look at putting the fuel farm facility in the area now where the old weather service building is currently located, and soon will be demolished or removed at some point, sooner rather than later. Alternative 3 would be down on the south end of existing Front Range facility. Alternative 4 is in a similar location, but a little bit north, across from the county jail. And alternative 5 is an idea of a split facility where you could have a Front Range specific facility down basically alternative 3 down in this area here, and then slide over into the area that Holman now parks some of their fueling trucks, and there's an empty apron space right here. Put a few tanks for their use as well in that area.
And the difference between like 1 through 4 and 5 is more than just the subtle location difference. You know, remember we talked about this a few months ago. That's really a difference in the approach to fueling. Today, what we have is we have the underground tanks, and again, we can't redo those or even really do a lot of modification to that. It's in the last 10 or 15 years, that type of fuel farm has become obsolete and unallowed. And what we need to go to is a double-walled above-ground tank with a full containment bib. You know, that is the modern facility, and it's what you can get permitted. And so, you know, we talked about this before. Today, our model is we own the infrastructure of the fuel farm, and then the FBOs are using it. And what you would find at most airports our size is the FBOs actually own their own fuel infrastructure. And there's a subtlety there that's important, because today we're in the supply chain, the authority is in the supply chain of delivering the fuel into the airplane. And if there's ever a major crash, you know, and the attorneys are going to be looking for, you know, opportunities, you know, we're in that supply chain. And, you know, as a public agency, we're a fabulous target. You know, and so again, there's a liability in there that's implied. You know, I think if, as I said this morning, if we could snap our fingers and move to a new model, I would want the FBOs to own those facilities. And I realize there's a bridge of cost in there that we've got to find a way to work with our partners to see if we can get through it. But this is emblematic of the FBOs owning their own facilities on their own location. And frankly, if we went with this model, the location would be at their choosing. You know, we're not really that engaged in telling them where to put things. You know, so I mean, Dwight might say, I like this spot, so that spot, that would all be fine. You know, he would have to go through a permitting process, which involves the state, to get his facility in, and then he could have it where it works for him, and same with Mike. So this is a decision that will come to the board in future meetings, where we need to make a determination how we want to proceed with this piece of the business, whether we want to reinvest ourselves in that infrastructure for the FBOs, or if we want to look to them and say, you know, we need to get out of this business, and we need you guys to take over this business. And so I think that's the difficult discussion that, you know, we're going to have to navigate.
90, I assume 90+% of all fuel that is pumped here goes through Holman. Is that correct?
More than,
No,
because all the airlines are.
breakdown. Yeah, the
So
airlines.
99%.
Probably,
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
so,
of the airlines.
yeah.
Right.
so, you know, Dwight would have a larger fuel farm, and then obviously, you know, Front Range would have a much smaller. And then remember, they both have two products. They have low lead, 100 low lead, which is for the piston engine airplane, and then they have Jet A, which is for the jet engine airplane. So even within themselves, they need to have two tanks. And another thing that we talked about this morning is, if we decide, if the authority decides to pursue redoing the tank farm, you know, with us owning it, my recommendation is we work very hard with the tenants to get to 2 tanks. You know, today we have a plethora of tanks out there, and it doesn't do anyone any good. At most bigger airports, all the gas is blended. So, you know, Delta may be buying from the Conoco refinery, while, you know, in Seattle, for example, while United is buying from Chevron, but they all pump it into the same terminal, and it's controlled inventory-wise with a pin code system. You know, and so the benefit to that is, instead of bringing, you know, we're going to have a full containment bib the truck pulls onto. If it's 2 tanks, they can both pull onto the same bib and fill from that Jet A tank if that's what they're getting that day. If it's 4 tanks, now we have to have 2 containment bibs for 2 separate trucks to pull onto. I mean, right there, you're doubling the cost of some of the infrastructure. You know, so I mean, that was another thing we kind of said this morning. Some of the fuel suppliers hate that idea because, again, they're losing control of their product. But, we'd have to really work hard with those fuel suppliers to try and get there, with that type of a model.
Yeah, the branded companies, because I know we still.
They hate it.
The airlines we can commingle, but
Right.
the branded we cannot. And then, of course, we also have military grade product.
Well, and that's true
And they're
too.
separate
So we
things,
might
so-
even be into a third tank,
Yeah.
with the AP, what is it? I've lost it.
JP8.
JP8, thank you. I was going to say AP8, that's not it.
So you're pumping the military fuel too?
Transient military,
Homeland
everything except the
Security.
guard.
Mhm.
And I guess the Homeland Security is not transient. We do
Yeah. So we would need 3 tanks no matter what, but the idea would be to get to 3 tanks rather than 6 tanks, or 5 tanks, that, just adds cost.
And what we'd like to accomplish as part of the master plan is, again, get our arms around what facilities, how big is the envelope. We've got a general idea here this is actually a footprint from an existing fuel farm that we're relocating for another client. It is a 120,000 gallon capacity total here. But understanding what the footprint is, your needs, both the FBOs, laying that out in a location that you all agree to that we think is great. Another consideration that was brought up, a very good one by Dwight earlier, is none of the trucks are meant to be on public roadways. So we want to keep an inner airport property access system in place for the trucks to operate. So those are definitely things that we'll be looking at as we move through the alternatives. Land side, I'll go through these very quickly. There's actually a lot of, the boards back here in the far right corner in the back of the room show a lot of the options that are available. But what we're dealing with is a couple of things. We're dealing with general roadway access to the airport and then closer into the terminal, the circular routing, the parking around the terminal. And a couple of the highlights that I'd like to point out is, first and foremost, we know that the I-15 interchange needs to be addressed at some point down the road, sooner rather than later, I believe. Montana Department of Transportation, these alternatives right here are actually out of a recent corridor study that they've put together. 2 additional ideas we've talked about with John and whatnot, but that's going to need to be an issue that's addressed. Also, for both the frontage road and Airport Drive, the expansion from the 2-lane configuration of each to 4 is going to be necessary throughout by the end of the planning period. The entryway to the guard facility, whether it's a roundabout or a signalized intersection, that's something that's going to, or a relocated entry point in general, that's something that's going to have to be considered. Limited access points to the guard base is going to need to be considered, secondary access to the guard base. And then when we get down to what we're looking at for terminal roadways and parking, it's a matter of, here are a couple options here, option 1 and option 2, and really the difference in colors is where do we want to look at putting long-term parking? Where do we want to put short-term parking? Where do we want to put employee parking? There's probably elements of each of these that make sense that we're not saying that one is exclusive of the other. If there's parts and pieces of this one that make sense versus the other, that's the ultimate probably configuration that we'll come up with.
And the key right now is we need to have space available for parking, period. I mean, how we reconfigure those over time to be employee versus rental car, but when you look at it, parking is $1 million of our revenue. Rental cars adds another 800,000. So, we're sitting at about $1.5 million, $6 million, $7 million, around in there of $3.5 million that's coming from parking a car. So I mean, we've got to guard that with our life because it really is our matching for our grants. It's the revenue we use to do projects. It is an important part of our infrastructure. And so, what we've done in here is tried to maximize the area that's available for parking in the future using these lots these spaces near the airport. You even see we've moved the rental car wash. That's a back of house use. Where it can happen anywhere, even move down the frontage road. It's adjacent to the new road we just built with the plan that eventually we would take that down and incorporate that into where we just put the value park in. So With the value park, what we've done is we've gotten ahead of the parking demand, hopefully 5, 6, 7 years, by creating this new capacity. That's going to give us the opportunity to close areas of the parking lot and do some of these infill projects. You can kind of see up there, there's different colored options inside the parking lot. So with the value park, we can close off large chunks of the parking lot, do those infill projects and get that done. And while we're not doing that, we can operate the value lot like a discount product. And what that does is it lowers the demand for off-site lots. As a consultant at airports, I always warned airports, when your daily rate starts getting up to $7, $8, $9 a day, it becomes economically feasible to have off-site competitors. And so you need to guard that somewhat, because as you make it more feasible for land uses around the airport to become parking lots, first of all, the land use isn't that terrific, right? I mean, how many roads around airports have we been down where it's just parking? 99 and SeaTac's a great example. I mean, the city of SeaTac would love to get rid of those parking lots. But SeaTac over time has lost 70% of the parking market to Wally Park and others, who now make Highway 99 a giant parking lot. And so, that's what, by doing this value park, it allows us to prolong our market share for the interim until we need that lot in the long term for demand. And so it gets us out in front of it and provides some strategic benefit to the lot over time.
Yeah, per our analysis, with some of the improvements that you're making right now, you can only squeeze so much out of it, but the demand over the 20-year time frame, we can go about 1,300 spots with some of the tweaks making now.
Oh, I think it's much more than that.
Yeah, well,
Are you talking about in the existing lot? Yeah, we can get up to about 1,300 around in that area without opening up brand new areas.
Right, and that's the point I was going to make, is that we're showing that by the end of the 20-year time frame, you're going to have a need for about 2,300 parking spots at some point, through that 20-year period. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to go real quick through some of the terminal alternatives and the rationale that we've come up with. Nate?
Thanks, Chris. We start off, as Chris was saying, with just assessing from the analysis that was done for the 20-year planning period, what sort of deficiencies do we currently see in the terminal building itself as we start looking at those the demand criteria. And ultimately, by looking at the analysis, came up with seeing deficiencies, future deficiencies in that 20-year plan of baggage claim, departure lounges, baggage screening, rental car to a much smaller degree, and some circulation components. So kind of take each of those individually, and we'll look at them real quick. From baggage claim, starting off there, looking at an existing plan of what your current facility looks like. We have these current devices, these island devices that come through from the air side onto the land side and circulate back around. The devices themselves are kind of outdated. They're old. They're reaching their life expectancy, as well as the FAA would like to get away from the types of devices that go through the secure wall and then enter back into the secure wall if the bag's not picked up as first time around. There is the possibility that it could be compromised and goes back in. So try to get away from that in the small likelihood that would occur. In addition, you can see how these devices extend quite a ways into the space that you can't circulate around. So a lot of people congregate right in here. And if you've been there during peak times, you find with a lot of the meter greeter traffic that you guys get here, a lot of people meeting people coming back from wherever they are, we end up getting a lot of congestion right in this area here. So we're trying to solve a couple of different problems there. We're trying to improve the security. We're trying to replace the data devices. And we're also trying to improve the circulation as well as improve the waiting area. So we looked at a couple different options. Both options look at expanding and freeing up the existing space of the bag claim by putting a small addition off to the west side. We consolidate the rental cars over on the west side, and as well as the entry access point over to the rental car facilities. And then we put two new devices in here. The idea being that these devices are going to be carousels that are pulled off from the back wall so you can circulate around the devices, hopefully pulling more people in. They're going to be served overhead, so the tugs will drop off bags on these belts. The belts will go up, poke through the wall, come overhead, and then drop down into the carousels that way. So we're solving that this potential security issue. We only now have one opening in the back wall. Also in doing this, what we need to do is do a little bit of interior demolition to allow a more direct and open tug route for the tugs to get through. Another option, very, very similar, just a slightly different way of bringing the tugs in. Well, we looked at an option of coming underneath the bridge connector to gate number 1, coming in that way. It creates a little bit of an island of space here, some office space that used to be part of a FIS facility. So we'll have to look at the pros and cons as to whether or not that makes sense to do going in the future. But in any case, either of these options looks at, if we do want to go even further than what we're looking at the 20-year plan, we can kind of take this basic idea and move it out to the west even further to create even more space for bag claim if and when that becomes necessary. We start looking at the check baggage inspection system. The way that it's set up now is each of the different airlines have their own inspections. A lot of it is done by hand inspection. It's not hugely efficient. We'd like to try to create a much more secure and efficient situation. So we're looking at consolidating the bag screening area. We want to right size the airline ticketing offices. Right now they're kind of all over the place. We want to expand the ticket lobby queue because we noticed as we were looking at improving the security in here that we realized that there's a couple other issues at play here too. And if you've ever been here in peak times, you realize that the queuing of the ticketing is commingled with the circulation. Creates a bit of a congestion area in that area too. So, solution here, we just recently expanded the back of the building. We now have the opportunity to push this whole assembly underneath the underside of the new expansion, frees up the circulation at the front of the building, gives us a nice big queuing area, allows us to put some new ticket counters in there. We've right-sized all of the airline ticketing offices. We now have the blue takeaway belts. It comes back to a centralized, more efficient bag screening configuration, which allows all the bags to go back to these two devices, these two new CT80 devices, a lot smarter than the individual devices that you currently have now.
Well, actually, we have two CT80s today. What we have today is every ticket counter shotguns straight back. So there's two CT80s back there today, and then United is the old technology, ETDs, which is hand screening and a lot more bag inspections. So we actually can reduce the equipment. We have the two on site today. We can reduce the amount of equipment there and make it a much more efficient operation. A little more bag belt, but other than that, it's a much simpler solution than what we have today with existing equipment.
Right, yeah. And then what that does then too is that they all feed back into a single belt, comes back out to a single location for makeup bags, so you can take the bags out to the aircraft. So again, it makes the whole process quite a bit more efficient. And for potential future expansion as well, then the opportunity is we can take away some TSA break room and some offices right here and expand just with a little bit more of interior renovation to get even another ATO space, expand the belt, a little bit more queuing as the need arises.
So that'd be a new airline coming in. If American comes tomorrow, we basically bump the TSA out of their existing space and replicate the ticketing lobby that we have now right next to it. So that's our expansion path for the future.
Looking at arrival and departure areas, this is a graphic of the 5 current departure lounges that you have now. When we were looking at this a couple months ago, realized that we really don't want to spend time and money here on the extents on 1 and 5. They're outdated for one. They're very, very small. If you've noticed, if you've flown out of either one of these, the hold room area really spills into the circulation area. We've got chairs up and down here, so there's no bathrooms on the end. We want to pull everybody in to kind of this nice new area that we just recently completed. So the idea was that we're going to look at a pier expansion, so we're going to push out here. We want to make room for 6 gates. We want to create common use gate utilization. 4 remain overnight positions was kind of something that we decided we wanted to have as well. It leaves gates 1 and 5 essentially obsolete. However, there is the possibility that perhaps in the future, gate 1 could be allocated for an FIS facility, because underneath here, we have the kind of the infrastructure to allow that to happen. FIS is Federal Inspection Station. So if we ever had a charter business where we had some Canadian flights, or if we had summertime flights in foreign countries, we could use that facility. The other thing we could use it for is occasionally we get a diversion out of Calgary, and we've got to detain those people. That'd be a perfect place to lock that area off and have the ability to do that type of operation. So we looked at options. That's what I was talking about. It's a pure type of event. So again, just continuing out the second story pier, at the end of that pier, having a large kind of open departure lounge hold room configuration, allow these the hold rooms for all these different gates to potentially commingle. It makes it a much more efficient space. There's an opportunity for concessions there if and when you wanted it. We'd probably put restrooms out there as well. Something to notice here is that all 6 of these gates show the ability to accommodate up to a 737, which is our design aircraft. Not to say that we're going to have 6 737s here at any one time. It just shows that we can create the flexibility that the airport can be as flexible as possible as far as the allocating of that type of aircraft into any of the gates. So the spaces have been designed to accommodate the future schedule, which is the combination of RJ aircraft as well as the 737s. But we do want to show that the opportunity is there to be able to park the larger aircraft at any of the gates. So when you look at this from an overall standpoint on the facility itself, and we look at green being the areas of expansion, yellow being the areas of renovation, then to create this 6-gate configuration, we have now the pier that we just talked about. We've got the small bag claim addition. It's going to require some interior renovation to accommodate that bag claim addition. And then downstairs on the first floor, we have renovation to accommodate that ticketing. In addition to that, what Chris alluded to earlier was in order to accommodate the pier, we would have to have some additional apron concrete that we'd have to add in there just to accommodate the routing of the aircraft, as well as for the remain overnights. We've got a little bit of chunk of concrete on both sides that would need to be added just to accommodate that.
And the main overnights, I mean, like take United, for example, we'd like to have a Chicago flight. Chances are to tie into the hub connections at that departure time similar to the Denver departure time. What that allows you to do is keep the plane off gate. They both come in at night. It's a long haul flight, so you want that plane to be able to RO in. And say the flight times are 20 minutes apart. The Denver flight might leave first, or Chicago probably would leave first. And then they would tug the other plane over onto the gate, and you get to use that gate twice for the same operation, rather than building 2 gates for that airplane to be at, which is a much more expensive proposition to have a gate for each plane. RON space, much cheaper than building 2 gates for the same airline. So that's the thinking there, because we are at the end of the spoke, and we're far, we're 800 miles from our closest air service market, more or less. These RON spots give us a lot of flexibility to accommodate multiple city pairs as we grow in the future.
And when we start looking at each of these different alternatives, as Chris mentioned before, we're starting to look at how do we evaluate those? How do we put those into a chart that we can kind of check the box? And so our criteria is varied. Some of the important things obviously are cost, operational impacts. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing here is not going to affect any of the air service. There's going to be some inconveniences to passengers perhaps in some airlines and some concessions, but as far as the operations, we want to make sure that those are minimized or eliminated altogether. Long-term facility requirements, that's a big one too. We want to make sure that what we're designing and what we're planning for is not kind of pigeonholing us and not allowing us the opportunity to grow even further. So we want to be real clear about making sure that the space that we've identified to be usable for these types of facility requirements aren't limiting us in any fashion going anywhere in the future. As well as access to parking, there's issues we talked about when Chris looked at some of the different parking configurations. When we're pushing out to the west with our bag claim, well, we're affecting some rental car parking there, so we'll have to make sure that we're supplementing that somewhere else. And finally, the last thing that we looked at was beyond plan. We've been talking about our design year being a 20-year plan. What happens beyond that? And so we started to look at, well, a good way to assess that is to look at your primary processing components, your bag claim, your checked baggage screening, as well as your passenger screening. And right now, what we've been looking at for our design year is 223 peak hour passengers and 5 required gates. That's what our analysis has kind of showed us. So then, when we were out here a few months ago, we thought, well, for the foreseeable future, we kind of came to the conclusion that we really don't see much more need for more than 8 to 10 gates. So if we extrapolate those numbers there to an 8 to 10 gate configuration, I picked 8, then we got about 360 people that we have to accommodate in that peak hour configuration. So then you just do some mathematics and figure out that, well, the space that we have available currently for our checkpoint, we can accommodate 516 people. So that works pretty well. The checked baggage inspection system as well as the bag claim are a little bit undersized to get much beyond that 20-year plan or into an 8 to 10 gate configuration. So some additional expansion would be necessary. And so when we start looking at what that looks like graphically, it could look something like this, where we've got our 20-year plan right here, and if we want to go to an gate configuration, we can just push out a little bit further into the apron. It sets us up. This pier creation sets us up for more future considerations and possible growth. Same thing applies going to the west. The 20-year expansion here could just be added on to get another device as necessary. We're thinking that it's probably going to be pretty easy to reconfigure with new technologies, ticketing technologies and bag drop technologies that will get even more efficient as time goes by and be able to kind of reallocate the space that we've got in the ticketing and bag screening to accommodate yet another CT80 machine as necessary and just really keep that as efficient as possible. So with that, it just kind of shows that what we're doing for the 20-year plan doesn't preclude us from going even further. But as we alluded to before with Chris talking about the greenfield site, there's going to come a point when, you know, the infrastructure of the building, bathrooms, things get outdated to where it starts to make sense. Parking's a big thing. It starts to make sense to make that jump to the greenfield site. But certainly in the foreseeable future, we're in good shape with these types of modifications.
Okay, so it's hard enough going out 3 to 5 years. 20-plus years is kind of a little bit of a wing and a prayer. The main thing is that we can be flexible.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
when is the next look at the 3 to 5 year plan? Because how often do we review this? Because even things could change a little bit.
The way
I mean, inside of 10 years.
Yeah,
for
the
sure.
way to think about the master plan, and as they get into the write-up, this is what it'll allude to, is you kind of ignore the years, and what you're looking for are the activity triggers. You know, so when we get so many flights per day, we need this many gates. When we have so many enplanements per day, we need this much concentration of screening and bag claim. You know, and so that's what you're looking at is you've got this 20-year plan, and if you've done a good job, you're never going to exceed that demand in 10 years. That's the goal. And so you just slide the scale down and you say, we thought we were going to have 3.5% growth. We've had 6% growth for the last 5 years. We need to be out here in year 15 of the plan building these facilities. And so that's how it looks is every year you're looking at your facility and populating this capital plan, the 6-year capital plan, with projects to move you towards making sure you can meet your demand. You know, and so when we started the terminal project, we were a little behind the ball on that one. Our checkpoints were outmoded at the time. You know, that one should have been on the books another 3 or 4 years prior to when we started it.
Okay, so you've got a number of different options, you know, for airport side, for building side, for all that. So do you decide now which one of those you're going to do, or is that going to be decided? Those are just your options as you go down the road and you fine tune it when you get there.
So you'll fine tune it when you get there, but for the master plan, these options would all be shown.
All be a part of the plan.
Yes, what we need to do, and that's good because, you know, 5-6 years down the road, you know, let's assume we're all gone. You know, the next administration goes, well, they must have had a plan for what they were going to do with the demand for parking. Let's look and see what's in the master plan. When I got here, that's the first thing I did was get the master plan. Go, what in the heck were we supposed to do with our parking and terminal? Unfortunately, the last master plan was very focused on the airfield, so I didn't find a whole lot. And then I also found that the airfield solution was closing 1634. So we immediately began rewriting the planning. You know, and you know, the very first thing we did was rewrite the planning to reverse the runway configuration because the runway we would have been left with on the crosswind was only usable by the smallest of planes. You know, so immediately we rewrote the planning. Now here we are from, you know, we started that plan in 10. It was accepted in 12. Here we are in 16 about ready to make that improvement. You know, so that's a great illustration of, we have a problem. We need to get in front of it with the planning, and we need to have a plan to implement it. And next year we will implement that plan that came about in 2011. And so that's how you're constantly referring to that plan. Same with parking. You know, these plans here, the reason we're building the short-term lot now is we need to get out 5-6 years ahead of the demand so that we can get into the current lot and make the improvements to it to get more capacity out of it. You know, and so that's why, you know, we're building that lot today. You know, and when you look at the terminal, for example, we already have the planning done for the CBIS system that's in this plan. You know, we did that 2 years ago. So, you know, in the next couple of years, if our ticketing lobby becomes an entire zoo, we have the plan to address that. We know what we want to do that. The planning is ready, it's on the shelf. We got to go to TSA and get the grant to do it. So that's the next one. And you asked me about it. Are we going to do it in 2 years? I hope not. I hope we can last longer. Our debt pays off. Almost all of our debt is gone in 8 years. So everything we can kick off into 8 years from now, we're going to have a lot more flexibility to deal with. And I think we can make it. I mean, I really believe we have enough facilities right now to get there. So that's kind of one of the goals here as we look at this. Some of these major expensive elements like the next round of terminal planning, it looks to me like we can get 8 years into that next one. And then maybe at that point we do the bag claim plus the CBIS, and we come up and renovate the concourses a little bit to get us another 5-10 years out of those before we start moving to the piers. And so I mean that's how the planning all works. You're constantly looking for that next phase.
Yep.
Next is general aviation development alternatives. The first couple slides here is just an overview of what's in place today. This particular slide shows on the north side and shows a more broad perspective, including the terminal area. This drills down a little bit more on the south side around Front Range in the existing area available today. So, and this kind of speaks to what John was just saying. Through our analysis, based on variables that we were able to grab a hold of and analyze today, for general aviation facilities, we're showing a need per current demand of about 3 acres of additional space for GA development. Currently have 21, you're looking at needing 24. Well, the way the planning process works and the way that I like to handle this is I don't want to be limiting, and I want to be more proactive. I don't want to be short-sighted in the way that we look at their planning opportunities. So while we only need 3, and we'll go into this in a second, we're showing facilities that go well beyond the need for 3 acres of development, and that can happen over time. It's demand-driven. If there is a trigger that comes in, or that triggers an event, a new operator, a new tenant, that brings in significantly more traffic and operations than we were expecting or we could foresee in this element, in this instance, then you can go back and review it, like John said, and reanalyze things. But we certainly want to reserve the space and show some ideas for that long-term development.
And part of the reason, so this is backcasting some, and that's how you end up with 3 acres ahead. And, as we had our open house last night, one of the GA community members said, listen, I remember 6-7 years ago how many planes moved to Fairfield. And that's why we only need 3 acres in the next 20 years, is we've booted so many people out of here because we haven't been proactive. We didn't have any land developed, that was available. And so, what we see and what you'll see with this plan is we're preparing for a sea change in how we approach GA. As we get Red Horse up here next year and open up those parcels, now we're going to have a 20-acre parcel that we're tapping into that has infrastructure that's ready to go. And bringing somebody like Jeff in, if that ever works out, bringing that into our GA community and grafting that in brings a level of excitement that is going to bring airplanes back to this airfield that are sitting on private ranches and over in Fairfield and some of these other rural airports. So that's the goal, is to re-energize that development and create the demand for it. And with the GA community, that is very possible. In Colorado Springs, we had very little on their backlogs for hangar requests. We opened up a new condo development with a developer where you could come in and build out your own hangar in a condo development. There were dues that paid for the common space, and it became an incredible development. They sold the first 2 phases in weeks, and so they were on to 3 and 4 phases before I left there. We didn't think that was even going to happen in the planning period. So we literally had overnight almost 40-50 hangars, that we weren't expecting that kind of demand for. So that's the kind of thing you unleash when you create an area that's interesting to people and lets them invest in their own infrastructure, and that's what we're trying to do with these.
Here's an example on the south side.
Again, there's a question.
What's the revenue potential?
It's not huge. GA development,
12 cents a square foot, it doesn't seem like.
12 cents, yeah, right. We've got a hangar right now that we've been talking about in the board sense, and I think it's a very small hangar. I think it's 50 by 50, but I think that thing makes us, Laura could tell you right off, but I think it's, $1,000 a year, $600 a year for that one hangar. But it's, public use of the airport, and it supports, for instance, your corporate community. We've got one corporate client right now that's trying to get a hangar site in. You know, so it supports your business community in another way. I mean, this development here, you're looking at, you know, 20, 30 acres of development right there. I mean, that starts to add up at that point. You know, you're making $1,000 an acre, you know, $20, $30, $40,000 a year, you know, in additional revenue development. I mean, it starts to add up. But yeah, it is slow going, and it does take a long time to recoup that kind of investment. But, you know, we need to be available to the public that, you know, that flies, you know, out of the airport.
On the south side around Front Range, again, the need shows 3 acres, but there's up to 66 acres available. This key area here, the blue and the green, is reserved and will be reserved for future airport maintenance facilities, SRE, and other maintenance needs at some point. So we envision that alternative number 1 here shows a first phase, including the Red Horse development, this taxi lane, taxiway system through here. That's really going to be the impetus for immediate development in this area on the south side there. And with that lift station, as John talked about earlier, again, this is just a really good place to get things moving, maybe accommodate the museum and whatnot. The other option, alternative 2, we already know that there's 7460 that's approved by the FAA for that hangar site right there to be constructed here soon. So that'll also trigger some.
And that parcel's already leased, so you know that one is already generating, you know, it's $1,000 per year, you know, into the airport.
Things are a little bit tighter on the north end around Holman.
Lawrence Smith and
But if we assume that the fueling farm will be relocated and the SRE facilities, the buildings up there right now are all located down on the south end that I just showed you, that opens up some potential development opportunity up here with some large hangars and taxi lane structure in through here as well. So there is some opportunity up there, though limited. And this is this is the exhibit back here that we've been talking about. We want to make sure that whatever we do with some of the initial phases, that the development is allowed to be prudent. We're not going to stick a hangar or a couple hangars in this area that don't allow future phase development to take place. We want everything to be compatible as we move forward, and we certainly will make sure that that happens. Going back to a couple points I made earlier, you'll see some of the alternatives back there on the land side, alternatives with parking. This area has been identified for perhaps a remote parking lot. That would cut into this general aviation area, or vice versa. We've got that runway protection zone I talked about earlier. If we increase instrument approach capabilities down there, that might impact that area down there and reduce some space. Another issue that we're going to get into a little bit more analysis is the blast protection area for ordnance from the F-15 mission here. Since that's changed, is that an area that we can look at will that window shrink? Will that area shrink, and can we look at development? One of the ideas that John wants us to move forward with as we consider development is, let's go ahead and show as appropriate development within there, just to show that it could be used at some point down the road, and it may or may not get there.
no, the retail's on the other side of the road. Yeah, the retail, because it's not an
You can
airport
kinda-
function, it's
Okay.
not really evaluated in
Oh,
here.
That would be it right now.
Yep.
So I know I went through a lot of information. You know, these are initial concepts, initial ideas only at this point. And you know, to your question you asked a few minutes ago, yeah, we will include some of these in our narrative chapter and our justification and how we arrived ultimately at the final configuration that we come up with. We'll go through the explanation. Here's what we looked at. Here's why it didn't work or whatnot. But you know, again, it's up to you what you want to do. If you want to go and look at the boards, or I'll be here after the meeting if you'd like to go about it that way. But you know, is there anything at this point that resonated, or any questions that bubbled to the top that you'd like to discuss at this point, or how do you want to handle it? That's up to you.
We'll take a few minutes to look at boards, or?
What do you think? Okay.
I'd say the one summary comment, you know, having worked on a lot of master plans, both as a consultant and then on the airport side, you know, the one thing that's encouraging to me about this plan is we appear to have enough land and facilities and, you know, dollars to really meet the mission for the 20 years. And that's not always the case. I mean, there are many airports that are constrained by one of those things. But for us, there are reasonable solutions which are affordable, I believe, that are going to let us get to that future and even have options of how we get there. So I think that's a key finding that I'm seeing emerging from this already is, we're going to be all right, in the long term. And that's, like I said, it's not always that way. There are many airports where you look at it and you go, that's a challenge beyond what we can see solutions to right now. We don't have one of those moments out there right now. I think, that's the good news.
Okay, why don't we take 5 minutes to look at plans and come back.
You guys want to maybe staff the boards a little bit, and then, that way if they have questions at the boards, we can.
So just real quick, so over here we've got the first couple boards, the air side. In the middle here we've got the GA and fueling facilities. In the back corner to the left we've got the terminal facilities. And in the far back right corner we've got the access road terminal parking facilities.
If there's anything on there, the grazing lease is pretty straightforward. Master proposal is kind of interesting. We got to find some volunteers for the engineering selection.
Good question. I don't know.
And then we've got our SCASD grant. And then, the question of the hourly parking. There's some good stuff.
Mid-range numbers, probably towards,
Hey, Robert, this Raj. What's up?
These are the when it gets to your earlier, I guess you guys are having that question.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a lot easier than you know. Much smaller right now.
we calculated this rotation. Take that area, break it out to do. Simplify the area that way.
All right, good.
And then, if we,
You get a second chance.
because we're so far, planes come here and then go back. Is it foreseeable, like, we're to get a United flight, they would demand 2 gates, send them out?
This is why we have ROM spots. That's what I was saying. Generally, they've got some schedule flexibility. They're trying to hit a specific time, where they're what they call bang heads off. So there might be an 8 a.m. bang in Denver. There might be an 8 a.m. bang in Chicago. So generally, the eastbound flights are going to leave before the westbound flights. So generally speaking, that's not the case. But the reason we want these to is this plane might be scheduled out, it might come in 11 o'clock at night and be scheduled out at 7 in the morning. This plane might come in at 10:30 and be scheduled out at 9 in the morning. And so what that allows us to do is when they come in at night, they offload, then they tug it back and then this one goes out earlier in the morning. And they have some flexibility to move that time up. You just have a longer connection at your hub. So that's what you would see them do quite often, is rather than lease a whole other gate, they would try to make that work. Delta's, the opposite of that. They've got 2 hubs equidistant, Salt Lake and Minneapolis. Both the push times are similar to the hubs. They leave oftentimes at the same time or within 15-20 minutes of each other. So they choose to have 2 gates here. They also we charge per gate, and they want to be the dominant airline here, and that's one way you do it is by controlling more real estate. They always chair the airline committee. They get to make the majority of the decisions because they have the bigger footprint. So it's a strategic decision too, where Delta wants to be